Okay, today we'll be talking about the beginning of the Civil War. First, I'd like you to take a look at a series of slides, starting with the Revolutionary War. Now, after the slide presentation, what do you think about those slides? How do you think the public perception changed from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War? If you noticed, the Revolutionary War picture looked like a portrait, like glorious, like pretty much glorified war. You had Washington riding in on a horse, while the Civil War pictures were actual photographs. It showed men with their weapons, casualties on the field. So what would you think the public perception would be from the Revolutionary War time period to the Civil War period? All right, the essential question for this lesson: what were the events that led to the Civil War? Okay, the beginning of the Civil War. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, located on an island in South Carolina Harbor. The Confederates demanded surrender or face attack. The Union Army did not surrender, and the Confederates just bombarded the fort, while the citizens of Charleston cheered. Now back then, just picture this scene. Like the rich men and women, like the women with their petticoats and their parasols, drinking, just sitting there drinking, sitting in lawn chairs watching the battle. Like, it had nothing to do with them. They had no concern over the war. That's just was the mentality back then. The South just thought it was a formality that they would just run through the North and win the war. After the battle at Fort Sumter, Virginia seceded from the Union after the North's overwhelming response to Lincoln's call for volunteers. After Lincoln's response, he called for volunteers, the Union Army just rose in numbers. Bull Run. This was the site of the first major bloodshed in the Civil War. It took place 3 months after Fort Sumter, and it was thought that the war would end with this battle. But it didn't. The Confederate Army actually won this battle. Antietam. This was the single most bloodiest battle in U.S. history. Casualties totaled more than 26,000, and that rate was more than the War of 1812 and the War with Mexico combined. The South lost a quarter of their troops and retreated. Now, instead of following the Confederate Army and defeating them there, General McClellan refused to pursue them, and consequently, because of that, President Lincoln fired him. Now, these were the war strategies between the Union Army and the Confederate Army. The Union Army, the North, had the Anaconda Plan. It was a three-pronged attack. The first plan of the attack was to blockade the southern ports. That would cut off trade to the South, so they wouldn't be able to get supplies and ammunition. The second prong in that attack would be to split the Confederacy using the Mississippi River. And the third would be to capture the capital in Richmond, Virginia. On the other hand, this was the South plan. They had a defensive strategy. Their goal was just survival as a nation. They just wanted to be their own part, didn't want to have anything to do with the North. And their generals were instructed to attack or invade with opportunity. So even though they didn't initiate attacks like the North did, the North was strategically planning attacks. If an opportunity arose, the Confederates would take it. The politics of war. Lincoln's view of the Civil War. Now, his initial primary goal was not to eliminate slavery. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, that's what made the Civil War become about slavery. It became a weapon of war against slavery because it became the primary issue after the proclamation was signed. And Britain stopped helping the Confederacy because they already eliminated their slave trade. Alright, contrary to popular belief, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the United States. It did not free slaves immediately. It applied only to areas in rebellion. Military action aimed at states in rebellion did not apply to southern territory already occupied by northern troops. It did not apply to slave states that had not seceded. It meant symbolic importance and provided a moral focus for the war and invited slaves to participate in the Union Army. So the signing of the proclamation allowed blacks to join the Union Army and fight for their own freedom. Now, because of that, African American soldiers increased after the law was passed to let them in the military in 1862. African American soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army and fought in over 500 battles. They were led by white officers, but initially they were paid a lot less than the white soldiers. They were paid $10 to $12 a month instead of the regular $13. They were forced to do menial work. Their food wasn't as good as the white soldiers, but they did protest for unequal pay. And Congress passed a law in 1864 that gave the African American soldiers equal pay. Now, there was a high morality rate amongst the African American soldiers. Their duty was, in germ-ridden areas, execution or return to slavery if captured. It was just hanging over their head. 200 African American soldiers were actually butchered by Confederate troops at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by Colonel Shaw, was the first black regiment to see action. They stormed Fort Wagner in South Carolina in order to hold it for the Union Army. They lost the battle but fought valiantly, showing the courage of black soldiers. So even though they lost that battle, they put up a good fight. They were recognized for their goodwill. Wartime life. Now, because of the war, all the men were pretty much recruited to participate in a war. So that means women had to replace the men in factories and farms, and nurses worked on the fields during battles. African American women worked as nurses, spies, and also field workers. Prisoners, they had poor conditions in war prisons. Due to shortages of food and just lack of space, they had nowhere to keep them. 15% death rate in the South, 12% in the North. Those are pretty high numbers. Alright, the worst prisons in the South was Andersonville. They had a 25% death rate. And in the North, Fort Delaware, nicknamed Andersonville of the North. There, 2,400 Southern soldiers are buried at Finn's Point Cemetery at Fort Mott. Fort Mott is right in Pennsville, New Jersey. If you ever get a chance, you can visit Fort Mott. And from Fort Mott, they have a ferry that will take you over to Fort Delaware. Both are very historical sites and had a great impact on the war. And it would be something good to see for you guys. Now, the soldiers, the conditions were so bad, a lot of them, just uncleanly. They suffered from lice, dysentery, diarrhea, and lack of food. So a lot of them were starving, as you'll see in the following pictures. Here's a soldier suffering from, inadequate food. You can see the shelter in Andersonville prison. They were just living in tents in the wide open. And it was just cramped in there. It was really bad conditions. Now here's a short video that will show the conditions of Andersonville more clearly.
I'm Alan Marsh, the Cultural Resources Program Manager for Andersonville National Historic Site. During the 14 months of its existence, the last 14 months of the war, over 45,000 Union soldiers came into the gate, into this prison camp. Of that number, almost 13,000 never left alive. It opened in February of 1864. By the following August, over 33,000 soldiers were crowded into a 26.5-acre site. Over 100 Union soldiers were dying each day, really due to the lack of proper food, water, clothing, medicines. And also the guards on the other side of the wall, the young boys and old men who were the guards. This area was just a low priority for the Confederate government, and as a result, the guards were not receiving the supplies they needed either. Many of the guards got up and left. A number of the guards died. Visitors to Andersonville National Historic Site really find three different areas. The National Prisoner of War Museum that opened here in 1998 to honor all American prisoners of war. The National Cemetery that includes the final resting place of the Union soldiers who died here. And it's also an active national cemetery. Veterans can still be buried here. And then there's the site of the Civil War prison camp, Camp Sumter, officially better known as Andersonville. There's several areas within the National Historic Site that I would highly recommend visitors to see. It really makes an impression on all of us who have spent any time here. One is Providence Spring. The springs still bubble out of the ground. It first bubbled out of the ground in August of 1864. When conditions here were at their worst, and over 100 prisoners a day were dying, and a great rainstorm came, just thunder and lightning and rain all morning and in the afternoon. And during that time, a fresh spring bubbled out of the ground, supplying a much-needed water supply for the prisoners of war. So today, visitors can walk right there up to the waters of Providence Spring. And it got its name because the prisoners thought it was an act of God or an act of providence. In addition to Providence Spring, there's the National Prisoner of War Museum. You can walk on a hillside where the Confederacy had their headquarters and look down, look at an overview of the entire prison camp. And to me, too, just to walk through the National Cemetery here, you walk through the sea of marble, just waves of marble headstones, row upon row, and you think, the story of Andersonville is a story about these people who suffered, who sacrificed, and who died fighting for what they believed in. You'll see the grave of a young drummer like Patrick Shea, or walk through the area where actually a female prisoner is buried. Her name is unknown, so she was buried as an unknown female soldier. And to see that who was here, it was black and white, young and old, just a great diversity of people, but thrust together here in the small confines of Andersonville Prison. That didn't matter. What mattered was the fight for survival. And to walk to the cemetery and see these stones, or walk through the prison site where we're at now, see the reconstruction of the wall that we've built, and some of the shelters or shebangs that show what prisoners built and lived in here. It just gives one a feeling that you can't experience just reading the words in a textbook. And there's nothing like seeing it, and there's nothing like visiting.
Photos of the actual walls at Andersonville Prison. The prison grounds today and during the war. These rare photos show some of the prisoners and the grounds today. The grounds are covered with monuments. Raiders were Union soldiers sentenced to hang for assaulting and killing other Union soldiers. These are their graves. The museum has numerous displays covering America's prisoners of war.
All right, so what did you guys think about that video in the description of Andersonville? It's pretty bad, right? Just imagine, just a short distance from here, you have Fort Delaware, which was equally as bad. So I really suggest if you get an opportunity, just take a ride out there. Take a ride through Fort Mott and Pennsville. You can see big guns mounted over the Delaware River. It's, you know, it's pretty impressive. It's pretty historical. It'd be good for you guys to take a ride out there and see that. But you did notice, you know, the malnutrition and just the cramping. It was just really bad conditions there. It was terrible. All right, the regional economic effects of the Civil War. In the South, there were shortages of food, salt, sugar, coffee, nails, and medicine. They drained their manpower into the army, so they really had no one to work in the factories or anything like that. Now, Union occupation of food growing areas. So the Union occupied every place where they had their crops, so they couldn't even grow their own food. Loss of slavery, that was their workforce. So now all of a sudden they had no one to work in the fields. So that contributed to their economic downfall. And their Confederate money was worthless after a time. Now in the North, they had growth in manufactured goods, steel industry, and food, because now they're building weapons and ammunition. Supplies such as clothing, munitions for the army increased production equipment due to the loss of labor in the war. Now here I want you to focus on this chart. You have Andersonville, Clara Barton, Fort Pillow, and the word shortage. I want you to place the vocabulary words that relate under the column of the vocabulary word. So we have nurse, massacre of 200 black soldiers, food and supplies, South, Southern prison, and angel of the battlefield. Now, a summarizing activity for this is what we call 3-2-1. First, what were the three changes or problems that affected the South during the Civil War? 2, what were the changes or problems that affected the North during the Civil War? And 1, what was one change or problem to a social group of your choice? I'm going to give you a chance to work on that. But while you're doing that, I want to go back to the first warm-up. About those photos. What do you guys think about those photos? What do you think the public perception was between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War? You think it was more glorified during the Revolutionary War days? Or, how do you think those photos impacted the actual war? You think seeing like actual photos is more important, had more of an impact than a portrait that was drawn by an artist? So that during the Revolutionary War, a lot of people didn't get to actually see things or hear the battles. But in the Civil War, it was real close to home. It was fought over widespread areas, and it had more of an impact. So it affected more people. So I just want you guys to think about that as you're completing the last assignment, and we'll pick this up again tomorrow.